give a brief summary of it?
Production function. Yeah.
The aggregate.
Okay. So the question is, what's the deal with the aggregate production function? Okay. Or roughly, that's your question?
Yeah.
So what is the aggregate production function? It's thinking about how, for instance, output changes as capital changes, right? K is capital here. So how does output change as capital changes? And so the question is, if capital goes up, does output go up? Yes, right? But, what are you going to say?
Well, question.
Yeah.
Is the capital human and physical?
So this is just, here we're just talking about physical capital, right? So we're just looking at one input. The same might be true for human capital, the same is true for labor, all right? But just if we look at one input, if we increase one input, right, how does output change? Output goes up, but it goes up at a diminishing rate, right? So in other words, the first few units of capital are very productive, but as we get more and more capital, we're getting smaller and smaller changes in output. And that's what we call diminishing marginal returns, right? That if you think here, right, what happens as we move from 1 to 2? We had a big change in output. But what happens as we go up here from 100 to 101? Our change in output is much smaller, okay? And so that's what we mean by diminishing marginal returns. The change in output you get from a change in capital goes down as the amount of capital goes up. So there's a lot of words in that definition, right? But it's really just saying as the amount of capital goes up, yeah, you still add to output, but you don't add as much as you did when capital was low. Mm-hmm.
And will we have to use the y equals f k l at all?
Y equals,
I have this. I don't exactly know what this is. I could have written it down completely wrong, but under the aggregate production function, I have y equals f in parentheses k comma.
I think that you might have, maybe you copied this from the book.
No, there's a lot.
Oh, maybe, well, I can't remember. I think I was flashing things up, but I might have written it, right? And all we're saying here is that output is a function of capital and human capital. L is labor or human capital, and then technology, right? And what is technology? The way that we take capital and human capital and put it together, right? So, yeah, I mean, I don't know. Once again, I was kind of, I was putting my own notes up. And so, yeah, that's what I meant by this. Okay, so it's just kind of another way of saying the same thing we said many times, right? Is that output is really a function of technology, human capital, physical capital.
Will we ever have to solve this or put numbers in?
Well, I have to give you a specific function, right? That's not really there's no specifics there. No, I won't do that. Not at this level. You take another econ class and we will, but not this one.
In the chat, Isabella had a question.
What'd you say?
Isabella had a question in the chat.
Oh, thanks. We have a review. I like a quick definition of total factor productivity. Okay, so what is total factor productivity? Total factor productivity is just simply a measure of aggregate productivity. It's essentially the way that we measure aggregate productivity. So if you think about how we actually measure this, really how economists go is they figure out what output is, and they figure out how much of output can we attribute to human capital and physical capital. And then what's left over, that's productivity. That's what total factor productivity is, right? So the actual measuring of this is a very complex question, right? But in theory, you're just trying to figure out, it's a measure of productivity, right? So using the words total factor productivity is really just the way we measure productivity. So one of the things I think this is probably came from the notes when I mentioned that 50% of growth caused by increases in total factor productivity. In other words, productivity, right? And what's mainly in this? Technology, right? I mean, to get a little deeper, it's difficult for us to get a direct estimate of what technology is, right? That's a hard thing to measure. So basically what total factor productivity is a measure of aggregate productivity. I should really be clear here, not associated with capital or labor, okay? So it really is a measure and largely of technology, right? And so when we say 50% of growth caused by total factor productivity, that's largely technology, though, without getting too deep, there's other stuff in there that are probably not technology, and that's just an empirical problem that economists have to deal with, right? Is we can't measure technology directly, so we kind of have to measure it indirectly. Yeah, Bradley.
Could you explain how economic growth hurts the environment?
Well, I don't want to go through that whole lecture again, but I'll say the Kuznets curve, right? The fact that there's not a linear relationship between the two, that probably economic growth at early stages hurts the environment, but economic growth at later stages helps, right? And so that's really that discussion of the Kuznets curve. Okay, anything else? Well, we might have a couple more minutes before we take the quiz, if you think about any questions between now and then. So what are we going to be talking about today? Well, like I said, today is an important lecture, right? Today is an important lecture because really a lot of what we talk about today is going to be the basis of a lot of what we talk about for the rest of the block, right? So this is an important class. And, I'll be the first to admit, this is probably not going to be the most hilarious, enjoyable class of your time at Cornell College, right? This is a bit of a grinding class, right? Because the things that we talk about here are really kind of building blocks that will help us talk about more interesting questions as we go forward. But there's not going to be a ton that's interesting today, right? This is a hard hat day, right? You kind of got to bring your lunch, bring your helmet, and do some work. Because what we're going to be doing here today is talking about the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model. All right, the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model. This is essentially a model of the economy in the short run. So right off the bat, there's a couple of words in here that we need to make sure we understand what we're talking about. The first is a model. What's a model? In science, when scientists talk about a model, what do they mean? What makes a model a model? Anybody? Surely you've heard this. Yeah.
Scaled down version of market situation.
Yeah, right. I think that's a pretty good first start, right? It's scaled down, right? And in the process of scaling down, what do you also do? You simplify. You simplify. And so simplify is really the key word when economists talk about models. What is a model? A model is just a simplified version of reality. A simplified version of reality. Why do we need models in economics? Why do we find models so useful?
They help explain data.
Well, a good model will, right? A good model will, right? And how do they help us explain what's going on? I mean, why do we have to simplify in economics? Yeah, right. I mean, in reality is too complicated, right? Reality is way too complicated, particularly in economics, right? Particularly in macroeconomics, right? What's going on in the US economy? There's a million things that are going on in the US economy, right? If we tried to think of everything that's happening in the US economy all at once, we're not going to get anywhere, right? There's going to be too much to think about. So what do? We develop models, and models are simplified. What we try to focus on is what's most important. We try to figure out what's most important to think about, and then we try to ignore the rest, right? So if I can give you the best way to think about a model, it's this. All models are wrong. Some models are useful. To say that a model is wrong doesn't really mean that it's not a good model, because that's not really the point of a model. A model is not to try to capture everything. It is to try simplify things so that we can understand some things. Not everything, but some things, okay? So you have to think about models like this, that there is never going to be a model in economics that is perfectly right, that encompasses everything, because it's too complex. But we can develop models that simplify the real world enough so that we can begin to understand some of the most important factors, right? Some of the most important factors. And so that's really why economists use models. I wrote in your syllabus a quote from John Maynard Keynes, who is somebody we're going to talk about a lot. But Keynes says that economics is the discipline of thinking in terms of models and the art of picking which models most closely represent the real world, right? And that's very much how economists think. We develop models of the real world, and then we ask ourselves, well, are these models useful? Like, do they help us explain some of the things that we observe, right? Do they help us explain what the causes of recessions? Do they help us understand the impact of monetary policy or fiscal policy on the economy? And so that's very much how we're going to use this aggregate demand, aggregate supply model. It's a simplified version of the reality. There's a lot that's not in here, a lot. But we also don't want it to be too simple, right? I mean, it's got to be complex enough so that we can focus on important things, things, but we don't want it to be so complex that it doesn't help us understand what's going on. And so models, right? Models are very, very important in economics. If you take other economics courses, upper level economics courses, we will, spend a lot of time thinking about different models of the economy, right? In this class, we're not going to focus on too many different models. In fact, the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model is a big one. But supply and demand was another model that we talked about, right? I mean, that's essentially a model, a way of simplifying reality so that we can think about what's going on, right? Now, this is a model of specifically how the economy operates in the short run. Short run and long run. Those are going to be two words or two phrases that I use a lot here. And so let's be perfectly clear what we mean by the long run and the short run. The long run and the short run, because this is a distinction that is going to be really important to thinking about what we talk about here over the next, just over this class. When economists say the long run, what are we talking about? We are talking about average behavior. We are talking about average behavior over long periods of time. That's the long run. So if I'm talking about the fact that the US economy on average grows 2% a year, I'm talking about the long run, right? On average, the US economy grows 2% a year, right? That's over a long period of time. That's the average behavior. Or if I'm talking about the natural rate of unemployment, right? The natural rate of unemployment is really a long run concept. What's average unemployment over long periods of time, right? That's the long run. Most of what we've talked about in this class has really been focused more on the long run, right? We talked about economic growth over long periods of time. We talked about the natural rate of output, right? A lot of what we've talked about the last couple of days, inequality, right? Where we kind of took a bigger picture. We're really kind of talking about the long run here. What's kind of true on average in the US economy. The short run, though, is basically when we're not average, right? The short run is really deviations from the long run. When we have not average behavior, I don't know how you say not average. On average? I don't know if there's a word in the English language that completely captures not average. Maybe exceptional, right? But I'm not sure that quite captures it either, right? Behavior that's not average. Such as cyclical unemployment, deviations from that natural rate. So in the long run, we might talk about average growth. What are we talking about in the short run? Recessions. A lot of what we're going to talk about here over the next week is what about recessions? What about periods of time when the US economy starts to slow down, where we fall below what we see is true on average? How do we deal with that, right? How do we deal with that? So this is a very, very important distinction. It's really going to be hard to understand what we talk about going forward if you don't make this distinction between the short run and the long run. And so what I'm going to argue, we're going to put all the pieces here together today is we're going to try to build a model. And what's going to be true in this aggregate demand, aggregate supply model? We're going to have the price level, or P, up here. Notice this is not the price of a single good, this is the price level. And real GDP down here. I should be clear here, this is real GDP, not just GDP, real GDP. We're going to talk about an aggregate demand curve, meaning a demand for all goods and services within the economy. Not a demand for one good, but a demand for all goods and services within the economy. And then we're going to talk about an aggregate supply curve. But what we're going to see is what aggregate supply looks like depends crucially upon whether you're talking about the long run or the short run. That the long run aggregate supply curve can be thought like this, but the short run aggregate supply curve is upward sloping. Meaning in the long run, we're at the natural rate of output, which is where that long run aggregate supply curve is. And what determines the price level? Well, it's determined by the interplay between aggregate demand, short run aggregate supply, and long run aggregate supply. The key here is we're going to show how output can be different from the natural rate of output, right? We're going to show how output can be higher than average or lower than average. So if the natural rate is the long run level of output, we can be above that or below that. And this model is going to help us understand how this works, okay? So this is what we're going to try to build here by the end of the day, right? This is what we're going to try to build by the end of the day, right? Where this aggregate demand model comes from and how we can think about where these curves come from and what kind of things move these curves and how do these things all interact, okay? That's what I mean by building the model. Okay. So let's take this model piece by piece. The first thing we want to talk about here is aggregate demand. Why? Well, in part because aggregate demand is probably the most straightforward part of this. Okay, I showed up here a minute ago that the aggregate demand curve is downward sloping. There's a negative relationship between the price level and real GDP. Why does aggregate demand slope downward? Okay, so I can almost promise you, in fact, I will promise you, at some point I'm going to ask you this question on a quiz or an exam. And I can also promise you that a big chunk of you will get this wrong. Right? Because many of you will say, oh yeah, well, that makes sense. Aggregate demand is downward sloping. Because when the price level goes up, then I want to buy less stuff, and so output goes down. Okay, there's a real problem with that logic. What are we talking about? The price level of everything. And here we're talking about the production of everything. So if the price of everything goes up, do we buy less of everything and more of something else? There is nothing else, right? In other words, the substitution effect is not the reason why aggregate demand is downward sloping. It's the reason why an individual demand curve is downward sloping, but aggregate demand is something different. Here we're talking about the demand for all goods and services. So it can't just be that when the price level goes up, we buy less of everything. That doesn't make much sense. So why? Well, there's actually probably a number of reasons why aggregate demand is downward sloping, why the price level negatively impacts real GDP. Let me talk about some of these. One is the wealth effect, right? The wealth effect. Remember, what are we trying to do here? We're trying to explain why there's a negative relationship between the price level and real GDP. So what happens when the price level goes up? Well, one of the things we know is what just happened to the real value of all your savings. It just went down, right? When the price level goes up, then that $1,000 that you have in the bank really just became worth less in real terms. So what this does is it reduces many people's real wealth. How do they respond when they see their wealth go down? They stop spending, right? They reduce their demand for consumption. Firms reduce their demand for investment. And the demand for real GDP goes down. Negative relationship between the two. That's one reason. Maybe you can, well, yeah, go ahead. Consumption and investment, right? So yeah, so when we're talking about aggregate demand, we're really, in many ways, you can think about it as the components of that y equals c plus I plus g plus x minus m equation, right? Right, the demand for, you know, the expenditure, aggregate expenditure, or demand for spending is really a function of consumption and investment, government spending, exports and imports. Very closely related to this is what's called the interest rate effect, which is closely related idea. Which says when the price level goes up, not only does your real wealth fall, but what happens to the real value of your savings? The real value of your savings goes down. So think about our loanable funds market that we talked about the other day. You had some questions about this on your exam. What happens if real savings goes down? And savings shifts this way, and interest rates rise. So interest rates go up when prices go up. Real interest rates go up when prices go up. Now, how's that going to impact demand? If interest rates go up, does that change people's incentive to spend? Yeah. Does it encourage more spending? No, it discourages spending, right? Because all those things that you would have to borrow money for, a car, a new dishwasher, or firms who want to purchase capital are now going to find it more expensive to borrow to purchase capital. So we would expect to see the demand for consumption to go down, the demand for investment to go down, and once again, the demand for GDP to go down. Do you see why we don't talk about aggregate demand on day one of this class? Right? We really have to piece together a lot of the things that we've talked about before to understand aggregate demand. Right? We really have to piece together a lot of the things that we've talked about before to understand aggregate demand. There's a third effect here. I'm not really going to talk about this. I'm just going to put it up here because you might see this in your book, but we're not going to talk about it because we haven't really talked about international trade much. But there's also what's called the trade balance effect. And how does this work? Is it really works through exchange rates, which we haven't talked about. So I'll just say, later. Right? We'll kind of explain this later. We haven't talked about exchange rates yet, so let's just kind of put this to the side for right now. Okay, so that's aggregate demand. Once again, a negative relationship here between the price level and real GDP, right? A negative relationship between the price level and real GDP. Now, just like when we talked about regular demand curves, we talked about why a regular demand curve would slope downwards. If there's a change in the price level, what happens to aggregate demand? We move along our existing aggregate demand curve, right? But what happens if there's a change in something other than the price level? What's that going to do? Shift aggregate demand. It's going to shift aggregate demand. So the next thing we have to talk about is things that impact aggregate demand except for the price level. Okay, help me think about what some of these things might be. Now this is tricky because remember, we're talking about aggregate demand. It's got to impact the demand for a wide range of goods and services. Like, for instance, me going out and buying some new records is not really impacting aggregate demand, right? I mean, it is, but it's so minuscule that it doesn't really make much difference, right? So what are some of the things that are important enough to impact aggregate demand? There is one entity, clearly, that has a big role in shifting what aggregate demand is. What is that entity? Well, the Fed is one possible entity, right? Through monetary policy, through basically changing the supply of money and interest rates. So yes, that is one of them, right? The Fed manages money supply and interest rates and can use this to influence the demand for goods and services. So this is one of the things we're going to talk about next week, right? This is going to be one of our big topics next week. How the Fed uses its ability to change interest rates and to change the money supply to then change aggregate demand and to then influence GDP, right? So that's basically one of the big objectives of the Fed. And so we'll fill in the blanks, right? We'll talk about the details of what the Fed is, what the Fed does, how this all works, right? So we don't have to say much about this now other than to say, yeah, the Fed, right? Monetary policy is clearly one of the things that can shift aggregate demand. What else? You guys open a paper? What's being talked about today? Front page of the New York Times. Let's look. All right. So we have stuff on the coronavirus, right? Blah, blah, blah. This is actually not as high as it was yesterday. Oh gosh, dang it. Okay. One of the things that they have been talking about, there's nothing on the Times today, but this discussion about the fiscal stimulus package that Biden has proposed, right? What's the purpose of the stimulus package? It's called economic stimulus. How's it supposed to have economic effects? By government spending, right? Government spending, particular government purchases. Changes in government purchases is one of the big things that can influence aggregate demand. Government purchases are 20% of GDP. As we talked about, government purchases are about 20% of GDP. If the government spends more, can that influence governments? Can this influence aggregate demand? Of course it can. And specifically, if the government spends more, this is going to increase aggregate demand. It's going to shift aggregate demand to the right, towards higher output. The government doesn't just spend. What else do they do? Yeah, Max. Yeah. What? Government doesn't sell. Government saves, yes. Particularly, how much do they save? How does the government pay for its government spending? Taxes, tax policy is going to play a big role in this, right? Specifically, we would expect that a tax cut would stimulate aggregate demand. How is that? Well, I mean, it's pretty obvious, right? If people aren't paying as much in taxes, they have made more take-home pay. What do they do with the take-home pay? Spend it. Same idea is government just doesn't buy things, they also transfer money. Right? What happens if in this COVID bill, part of the COVID bill is a $1,400 check to families with a kid? What's the idea behind giving this $1,400 check? What are people going to do with that $1,400? Supposedly. Spend it, right? They will spend it. That should stimulate consumption and investment demand and increase aggregate demand. Right? So changes in government transfer payments can be one of the things that influence aggregate demand. Government plays a big role in aggregate demand, right? Government plays a big role in aggregate demand. And so this is largely going to be the theme of tomorrow and next week, when we talk exactly about how government should use fiscal policy. Fiscal policy would really be these three things, right? Government purchases, taxes, and transfer payments. How government uses fiscal policy to control aggregate demand. And we'll talk about how government uses monetary policy to control aggregate demand. How they should, how they do. When does it work? When doesn't it work? There's a couple of other things that could play a big role in aggregate demand. Changes in exports and imports can change aggregate demand. If exports go up or imports go down, that tends to stimulate aggregate demand. We'll talk a little bit more about this next week, right? Into the end of next week, when we spend a little bit more time talking about trade policy in the US. There's one last thing that I want to talk about, and I'll put a star by this one because I think this is going to be an important one as we move forward, talking about why recessions occur. But changes in confidence, consumer and firm confidence, or changes in expectations. In other words, psychology. Oops. Psychology likely plays a role in what aggregate demand is. Where people get overly enthusiastic and they spend, and then they get overly fearful and they stop spending. And so what this does is this tends to increase C and increase I during good times, which increases aggregate demand, and it tends to reduce consumption and investment during bad times. which reduces aggregate demand. This is going to be a very important part of Keynesian economics, which we're going to talk about today and tomorrow. Keynes believed that a lot of the reason why we have recessions is simply psychology. That the future is not only unknown, it's unknowable. Okay? What do I mean by that? It's not unknown, it's unknowable. The future is not like flipping a coin. Because what's true about flipping a coin? I know there's 50% chance I'm going to get a head and 50% chance I'm going to get a tail. Is the future like that? No. You have no idea what the chances you're going to get a head or a tail in the future, right? It's not unknown, it's unknowable. As a result, there's fundamental uncertainty about the way the world works. Because of that, people's expectations are very vulnerable, right? We tend to overreact to both good news and bad news. And what that does is it makes aggregate demand unstable. So this is the whole idea of animal spirits that I think I've introduced this concept to you before. Right? Where animal spirits makes investment and consumption, but Keynes particularly thought investment very volatile. And as a result, aggregate demand, in Keynes's view, is very volatile. This will become a very important part of recessions in the Keynesian view of the world. And why do we have recessions? Largely because aggregate demand booms and busts. During good times, it goes way up, and then things turn around and it goes way down, right? And that leads to a lot of volatility. Like that leads to a lot of volatility in our economy. Okay, so that's really the demand side of this, right? That's really the demand side. It seems like a lot. Well, the demand side is the easier half of this model, right? Because now we have to talk about supply. And when it comes to demand, I think economists understand demand better than supply in many ways, right? As we're going to talk about, there's not really as much fundamental disagreement about what aggregate demand looks like among economists of different stripes. But when it comes to aggregate supply, here's one of these areas in economics where there's quite a bit of disagreement. And so we want to try to understand that disagreement here as we build our model so that we can be real economists and understand both sides of the argument. Not just one argument or the other, but understand both sides. So aggregate supply is the supply of all goods and services within the economy. Okay, I just want to, before we get into this though, I want to just do a little bit of an aside, because I think this aside hopefully will help us think a little bit more about what's going on here. I want to talk about two big schools of thought in macroeconomics. There's actually more schools of thought than just two, but if you wanted to kind of take all these schools of thought and put them into two big categories, the two big categories would be kind of classical economics and Keynesian economics, right? And so I want to describe a little bit about the perspective of both of these schools. Shoot, my pen's not working again. Hold on one moment. And it is just beyond me why nothing can work very long. Like my pen is dying, though I had it plugged in all last night and it's relatively new. So I don't know why anything I have cannot consistently work. One more thing here. Okay. No. I mean, I really don't know. Okay, well, sorry, we're gonna have to move to the notes. I don't know what else to do. Maybe I'll try this in a couple minutes and we'll see if it starts working again. Okay, so let's talk about these two schools of economics, right? These two schools of economics. The first we can think of as what's called classical economics. And classical economics is really, it's called classical because this is really kind of focused on a perspective that Adam Smith brought to economics way back when economics was first founded, right? And this is kind of a perspective of perfectly competitive markets, right? Perfectly competitive markets where markets basically work very well. And according to the classical view of the world really focuses on the long run, right? The focus here is the long run in economics. So according to the classical model, what really matters? What really makes a country rich? More physical capital, more human capital, more technology. That's what makes a country rich. Yeah. Can I zoom in on the document? So human capital, physical capital, technology, that's what makes a country rich. That's what you should be focused on, right? That's what you should be focused on. So, because classical economists basically believe that markets work well, they basically believe in laissez-faire. And laissez-faire means, hands off. Basically, government interference in the market should be relatively limited. Government should not be overly involved in markets because markets work well by themselves. So yes, there are some things that government should do, right? They should have national defense. They should break up monopolies. They should provide public goods like education. But outside of that, right, classical economists really believe that markets work well, so there's really no need for a lot of government intervention in the economy. However, one of the things that classical economics really struggles with is if only physical capital and human capital and technology matters, how in the world do we have recessions? How do we have something like the Great Depression, where output fell by 50%? Right? I'll say that again. Output fell by 50% during the Great Depression. Unemployment rose by 25%. How do we explain a 50% fall in output using the classical model? Did we just like lose a bunch of our physical capital? We just like misplaced it, lost it in the cushions of the couch? No. Did we wake up stupider one day? No. Did we forget technology? No. It's really hard to understand how you have something like the Great Depression using the classical concept that only labor, capital, and technology matters, right? So there's this old, people who are not fan of classical economics say, have this old joke, how many classical economists does it take to change a light bulb? 0, right? When the market conditions are right, the light bulb will change itself. Right? It's not a funny joke, but it's illustrating a point, right? That somehow governments don't have to do anything. Markets will just kind of figure it all out, right? Markets will figure it all out and we'll be good. But the classical model really struggles with trying to explain recessions. And so while classical thinking about economics really dominated economics until the 1920s, basically, the Great Depression shook a lot of thinking about economics, and macroeconomics in particular, and really raised a lot of questions about, is this the right way to think about the economy, right? Is this the right way to think about the economy? So then along came this guy by the name of John Maynard Keynes. Here's a little picture of him, right? So Keynes is really the founder of the second school of thought, Keynesian economics. So Keynes, all economists are just fascinating individuals, but Keynes was a particularly fascinating individual. He was undoubtedly one of the most influential thinkers of the 20th century. In fact, they had a poll of academics in the year 2000 asking what was the most influential book of the last 100 years, and Keynes's General Theory was number 1, the most influential book of the 1900s. And so Keynes himself was a very interesting guy. He was an academic, but he was also a practitioner, right? He was a speculator in financial markets. He was an artist. He was a member of the Bloomsbury Group. For those of you who know, he was good friends with Virginia Woolf and a number of the poets of the day. He had affairs with many people of different sexes in the Bloomsbury Group. He then eventually married a world's most famous ballerina. He was a classical pianist. He was the bursar of Cambridge. He wrote books on statistics. He also, during World War I, served as essentially Britain's Treasury Secretary, and did essentially the same job during World War II. Winston Churchill said he was the civilian most responsible for the Allies winning the World War because of his brilliance with handling money. And so Keynes was this interesting guy that he was both an academic, but he had a lot of real world experience. And Keynes's basic insight is that markets are not perfectly competitive. Markets don't always function well. And particularly, they don't function well during recessions, when fear and psychology begin to play a big role. So Keynes focused on market imperfections, right? As I said, both in psychology, but also particularly in labor markets, why labor markets sometimes don't work well. And so as a result of that, prices and wages don't adjust. And what we can get is persistent disequilibrium. In other words, output that's below the natural rate, right? That should be YNR, right? Output that is below the natural rate. And so that's really the whole inside of Keynesian economics in many ways, is we don't have to be at the natural rate all the time, right? In other words, it's more than just human capital, physical capital, technology that matters, right? Other things matter, particularly in the short run. And those things can get us into trouble, right? Those things can get us into trouble. And also importantly, Keynes can say, well, who gets us out of trouble? Government can, right? Government can. Government, by using its tools of fiscal policy and monetary policy, can help put an end to recessions. So as opposed to laissez-faire, Keynes has a much more proactive, right, thinking about how government should be involved in managing the economy. So let's talk now about that short-run aggregate supply curve. Let me see if my thing is working. Hey. Is sharing? Okay. Here we go. We're back. Okay. So that should not be a cue. So an increase in the price level here leads to an increase in real output. Why is that upward sloping? Well, there's a few reasons, and I want to talk about why it's upward sloping. Particularly, let's begin with Keynes's main insight. And Keynes said, it's upward sloping okay. Oh, it's working for 2 seconds. Because of what he called sticky wages. Nominal wages are inflexible. And as a result, this leads to unemployment during recessions. So think about a labor market here. Right? And then we have a recession. And as a result, firms want to hire less workers. Labor demand goes down. Okay? So people get fearful, right? Think about this in COVID. Think about this a year ago, right? Pretty much, we're getting on that year anniversary of where the US economy began to kind of really get shut down, right? Or shut down. And so people were getting fearful. Firms were getting fearful. What are we going to do if people can't go outside, can't spend money? What do I need to do? I need to let some workers go. I need to reduce labor demand. Now, how would the classical model say? Well, the classical model says, well, that's okay. If labor demand goes down, then wages should fall to get us all back into equilibrium, right? But Keynes says, no, wages won't fall. They won't fall. And as a result, labor demand will go down here, labor supply will be here, and we're going to have unemployment. Sorry, not working again. Okay. We're going to get unemployment. So the question is why? Why won't wages fall? Why won't wages fall? And Keynes's response is, listen, classical economists are so in love with the market that they don't actually look at how people behave. In the real world, when things get bad, do firms just cut wages? No, they don't. And the reason is because they're afraid of what the effects are going to be. Okay? Let's talk about that here. Why don't firms just cut wages? Because there's other factors at work. One of them is that many people have labor contracts. Labor contracts prevent firms from cutting wages. Even when you don't have an explicit contract, there's often implicit contracts, right? So for instance, at Cornell, I'm basically on it. Yeah, I mean, it's actually never really quite clear how my employment situation at Cornell works. But in general, Cornell gives, every fall, Cornell says, here's your salary. And I say, yes, master, and sign, okay? And then that's my salary for the year. Now, if things get bad, could Cornell cut my salary? I mean, technically it's a contract, right? They can't cut my salary. Now, maybe next year they could offer me less, but once we sign that contract, they really can't cut my salary, right? And so many people operate under either explicit or implicit contracts, right? If you're in a union, you have an explicit contract that might last upwards of 3 or 4 years. If you're not in a union, a lot of people sign yearly contracts or month-to-month contracts. This prevents wages from adjusting very quickly. Also, there's minimum wage laws, right? Sometimes firms simply can't cut wages because they can't cut them below what a minimum wage is, right? So if you are working at minimum wage, you're not going to get a labor cut. But the third reason here, and if you want to pick one out that I think is the most persuasive, it's this. The idea of what economists call efficiency wages. Efficiency wages. What is an efficiency wage? Okay, so this is a different idea. It sounds wrong when you first hear it, but the more you think about it, you think about how right it is. Efficiency wages simply says firms don't want to cut wages. firms actually prefer to pay workers higher wages. Why? Because it gets them to work harder. Firms are very reluctant to cut wages because they're worried what impact it could have on productivity of their workers. Why might a wage cut reduce productivity? Well, I've got some things up here, right? One is it reduces worker quality if you cut wages. So think of it this way. If I've got a business and I say, listen, times are bad, right, because of COVID, I'm going to cut all of your wages 10%. What's going to happen? What are my best workers going to do? Get another job. And what are my worst workers going to do? Probably stay, right? So when I cut everybody's wages, I'm almost guaranteeing that my best workers are going to leave and my worst workers are going to stay. That's not a good strategy, right? That's not a good strategy for prolonging the business. What happens to those workers who stay? They're pissed off, right? And if they're pissed off, how hard are they going to work? Not as hard, not as hard. As a result, we tend to get more turnover, right? When you cut wages, workers are going to leave. And so turnover is really expensive for firms, right? In terms, particularly nowadays, when you think about firms, they have workers in their service-based economy where a lot of the cost of a worker is training them, getting them ready to do the job. And so if you got a worker, do I want to cut their wage and see them leave? Because if they leave, then I've got to get somebody else in here and I got to retrain them. That's really expensive. So, this idea that wages influence productivity is an idea that has long been understood among people in business, right? Henry Ford understood this. Ford understood that by paying workers more, I might actually get more out of them, and it's worth it. So at Henry Ford's first assembly line in Detroit, when he first started the assembly line, he was paying market wages, which is about $2.50 a day. And when he started paying market wages, he had about a 40% absenteeism rate every day. And his average worker lasted on the assembly line about 6 months. Why? Because people are like, this is a hard job, right? Why would I do this job for just a going wage? I'm going to work here and then leave, right? And so he had a huge problem with absenteeism and turnover and worker quality. So what did Henry Ford do? He said, okay, I'm going to double wages. And he started paying $5 a day. And what happened to his absenteeism? Plummeted. What happened to his turnover? Plummeted. And Henry Ford said, this was a better idea than the assembly line. Paying workers more, right, is a better idea than the assembly line in terms of increasing productivity. Okay? So just to back up to what we're trying to say here, firms don't want to cut wages. When push comes to shove, what will firms do? Cut wages or lay workers off? Lay workers off. They would much prefer to lay workers off than to cut people's wages because cutting wages really impacts productivity. Okay. So this is, I think, an influential idea because this is the reason why we get unemployment, right, during a recession. When firms start to see their profits go down, they can't really cut wages and keep the same number of workers or close to the same number of workers. So what do? They just lay off a lot of workers. And that's how we get involuntary unemployment, right? That's how we get involuntary unemployment. So once again, by talking about things like efficiency wages, what Keynes is saying is that that simple world of classical economics where markets work perfectly, it's not always the way that the world really works, right? And so, here you can see a little figure right? Wait, I'm trying to remember what this figure is. Yeah, right. So here's looking at percent changes in wages during a prosperous economy, meaning a time when the economy was in good shape in 1984. And what do we see? If we look among workers, there were lots of wage changes in 1984 because times were good, right? Firms knew that they could hire new workers. Workers knew they could leave and get new jobs. During when times are good, wages, it's a lot, wages are kind of freed up to change. But what happens when wages are bad? Or I'm sorry, when times are bad? Wages are frozen, right? Because firms can't afford pay increases, but they also can't afford pay cuts. And so what do? Right? They do nothing. So yeah, we see during good times, sometimes firms do cut wages, right, during good times, right, when they have to. But during bad times, cutting wages is really saying you're going to lose your best workers. Right? And so you see this wide variety of wage changes during good times, but wages are very sticky during bad times, and that's really that's Keynes's idea. So the key word for Keynes, though, just to make sure you understand this, is sticky wages, right? Because Keynes was never saying that wages never change. That's not his point. But they're sticky. They're kind of slow to change, and they don't change very quickly. And as a result, we tend to get layoffs, right? So, for instance, during a recession, when the price level falls, real wages go up, firms lay off, and we get a fall in output. That is a positive, if I can go back to it, that's our upward sloping supply curve, right? Where the real price, when the price level goes up, output goes up. But when the price level goes down, that increases real wages. Firms have to cut workers instead of giving wage cuts, and you get unemployment. That's the basic reason why aggregate supply in the short run is upward sloping. There's another reason why aggregate supply is downward sloping. And this one simply has to do with confusion. People often can't separate a change in the price of their good from a change in the price level. So as a result, wages are very slow to adjust once again. So think about a world in which, for instance, inflation goes up, but people don't really know that. If they don't know it, they're not going to demand higher wages. And so wages, once again, are very, very slow to adjust. What this means is that if the price level falls, that could lead to layoffs and a fall in aggregate output. So that's our upward sloping aggregate supply curve. Sorry, I'm checking to see if our thing is working. It is not. Okay. All right, what shifts short-run aggregate supply? Now that we've understood why short-run aggregate supply is upward sloping, let's talk about things that shift short-run aggregate supply. Well, this is a change in something other than the change in the price level. Specifically, a change in productivity. All those things that we talked about before, right? All those things we talked about before in the classical model, right? A change in physical capital, a change in human capital, a change in technology. So, for instance, if we have some new technology that becomes available, what's going to happen to our short run aggregate supply curve? Which way is it going to move? To the right or to the left? To the right, right? That's an increase in aggregate, that's an increase in aggregate supply. An increase in aggregate supply. That always looks a little funny to people. I don't know why, maybe because this one looks lower than this one, but no, this one is higher than that one, right? The second one is higher than the first one. If there's an increase in technology, now we can produce more at every price level. At every price level, we want to produce more. So, something that would shift those things that we talked about when we talked about economic growth, like a change in physical capital, or change in human capital, or change in technology. All those things would shift our short run aggregate supply curve to the right. Also, there could be some other things that would matter in the short run, like a change in the price of commodities, such as oil or energy or raw materials. And then there's a third one. And I think maybe I'm going to break off class here and I want to pick up this afternoon talking about this third one, because this one's going to take a little bit more explaining. The changes in expected inflation play a role in shifting aggregate supply. Okay? So, but really to get into this is going to take us 5 or 10 minutes, and I think maybe we want to reserve a little bit more time for questions and then take your quiz. So let's try to pick up here this afternoon. Hopefully this afternoon I can also get this freaking iPad to work. Maybe not. My expectation is that I will get it to work, but something else won't. So anyway, we'll see what we can do. But let's pick up here this afternoon at 12:30. In the meantime, we do have a couple of minutes. Does anybody have any more questions about Chapter 9 or about inequality that they would like to ask before we take the quiz? Okay, nobody? Okay, so I'm going to give you about 20, 25 minutes here. So I guess I'll ask you to wrap up by 10 to 11, right? Wrap up by 10 to 11. Those of you who are online, you can keep your camera on, and I will send you the quiz here now. Hold on. All right, here it comes. And yeah, okay. Would you mind? And also, I left my phone. Probably you can bring a couple copies. Probably 4 or 5. Sorry. I really have oops. done something to the gods of technology.